I am not walking you down the aisle. Your sister says it would upset her. That was my father 72 hours before my wedding. He delivered the sentence with the casual tone of a man canceling a golf tee time. My mother chimed in from the background, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, telling me to just go solo and be an independent modern woman. They expected me to break down. They expected me to beg, but I did not. When the doors of the church opened 3 days later, the man holding my arm made my father drop his custom bourbon glass in shock. Before I reveal exactly who took my father's place and how it tore his carefully constructed social empire down to the studs, please take a second to like and subscribe. Only do it if you believe toxic loyalty has an expiration date. Tell me your age and where you are watching from in the comments. Welcome to Luke Vengeance. Let us get into the story. My name is Abigail Smith. I'm 29 years old. I operate as a flight paramedic out of a Level 1 trauma center in Mobile, Alabama. Let me take you back to the moment that phone call happened. The truth is, I was not sitting in a bridal suite testing out lipstick shades when my father decided to ruin my wedding. I was kneeling on the aluminum floor of a twin-engine medevac helicopter 2,000 feet above the Gulf Coast. The cabin smelled of aviation fuel copper and sterile gauze. The rotors beat a frantic rhythm against the humid Alabama air. I had both hands locked over the sternum of a 40-year-old dock worker, pushing down 2 inches deep, 100 beats per minute. Sweat stung my eyes. My flight suit clung to my back. I pushed. I breathed. We landed hard on the rooftop helipad. The skids hit the painted concrete, and the flight nurse yanked the side door open. We rushed the stretcher through the sliding double doors of the emergency bay. The trauma team took over, and the monitor chimed with a steady, stable rhythm. We saved him. I stepped back onto the helipad to catch my breath. The August heat wrapped around me like a wet towel. I pulled off my latex gloves. My hands were stained with someone else's blood. My phone buzzed in the thigh pocket of my flight suit. The screen read Richard Smith. I hit accept. I hit, expecting a last-minute question about the seating chart. Instead, I got his ultimatum. "I am not walking you down the aisle," he said. His voice was flat, hollow, devoid of warmth. "Sloan had a panic attack this morning. She feels overshadowed, you understand." I closed my eyes against the blinding afternoon sun. Sloan was my younger sister, 25, unemployed, and perpetually exhausted by other people's milestones. A beat of silence passed before my mother Sylvia leaned into the receiver. "Oh, Abigail, just go solo," she cooed. "You are always so fiercely independent anyway. Be a modern woman. It will look stunning." The manipulation was so transparent it bordered on insult. They were stripping away the traditional symbol of family support, packaging it as a feminist choice, all to coddle a sister who could not stand sharing a weekend of attention. 5 years ago, I would have cried. I would have asked what I did wrong, but a decade of treating broken bodies teaches you how to triage trauma. You stop the bleeding first. You assess the damage. You do not negotiate with the wound. I checked my own radial pulse, steady 80 beats per minute. "Is this your final answer?" I asked. My tone held no tremor. It mirrored the clinical detachment I used when calling in a time of death. Richard scoffed, clearly offended by my lack of hysteria. "Of course it is, Abigail. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I did not let him finish the syllable. I pressed end. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone across the rooftop. I slipped it back into my pocket, looked out over the Mobile skyline, and mentally prepared for war. My father thought he was holding all the cards. He did not realize I owned the table. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my third-floor apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. It was a modest place, paid for entirely by double shifts and hazard pay. Liam stood at the kitchen counter grinding coffee beans. The rich, earthy smell filled the small space, offering a brief illusion of normalcy. Liam is a high school history teacher. He is quiet, deeply observant, and possesses the kind of steady gravity that cannot be bought. We had not discussed the phone call from the previous afternoon. He merely held me when I came home, knowing my silence meant I was formulating a plan. A sharp, authoritative knock broke the quiet. It was not the polite tap of a neighbor. It was a demand for entry. I set my mug down, crossed the living room, and opened the door. My father stood in the hallway. Richard Smith wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair impeccably styled, exuding the polished arrogance of a man accustomed to blind obedience. He did not come alone. Flanking him were two men in identical gray suits, clutching premium leather briefcases. They had the distinct predatory posture of corporate litigators. He stepped over my threshold without waiting for an invitation, bringing the sharp scent of expensive cologne into my home. The two suits followed, crowding my narrow entryway. "Good morning, Abigail," Richard said, his tone brisk and entirely devoid of paternal warmth. "Let us skip the pleasantries. You are a busy woman, and I have a board meeting at noon." He gestured to one of the lawyers, who snapped open his briefcase and extracted a thick stack of legal documents. The lawyer placed the papers onto my kitchen island with a heavy thud. The concerned father act from yesterday vanished. The narrative about my sister having a panic attack, the supposed fear of her feeling overshadowed, all of it evaporated like morning fog. The truth sat on my counter bound in legal clips. The aisle walk was never about Sloan. It was leverage. I looked down at the top page. The bold black font read "Transfer of Equity and Ownership." Below that, the name of the entity was spelled out in cold, unfeeling type: the Ironwood Distillery. My chest tightened, but I kept my breathing even. Ironwood was not just a business. It was my late grandmother Clara's legacy. She built that boutique bourbon distillery from the ground up in the rolling hills of northern Alabama. I spent my childhood summers there, breathing in the scent of sour mash, charred oak barrels, and sweet southern dirt. Clara taught me the value of honest labor, the kind that leaves calluses on your hands and pride in your soul. When she passed away, she split the ownership. 50% went to my father, the other 50% went to me. She knew exactly what Richard was, and she wanted to ensure he could never have total control. Richard tapped a manicured finger against the contract. "Sloan needs stability," he stated, smoothing his silk tie. "She's finding her way in the world, and she needs a proper financial portfolio. You are going to sign your half of Ironwood over to her." I looked up from the paperwork, meeting his gaze. "Why would I give my inheritance to a sister who has never worked a day in her life?" "Because if you do not, I will sell my half," he replied smoothly. His eyes were flat, calculating. "I have a buyer lined up, a multinational beverage conglomerate. They do not care about Clara's legacy or the artisanal process. They want the land and the trademark. If they buy my controlling interest, they will bulldoze the original tasting room scrap, the copper stills, and turn Ironwood into a mechanized processing plant. Clara's name will be erased within 6 months. I matia mi fasutao." He leaned closer, resting his palms on my counter, invading my space. "But if you sign this over to Sloan, the distillery stays in the family. She gets her portfolio. I guide her management. And you get to keep your memories intact. Do this, and I will graciously put my tuxedo on, walk you down that aisle on Saturday, and smile for the cameras. We can pretend yesterday never happened." He was holding a gun to the only piece of my grandmother I had left. He knew I did not care about the social optics of walking alone, so he targeted something that actually mattered. He wanted to funnel my inheritance through my pliable sister, granting him total dominion over the asset. I studied his face. There was no hesitation, no guilt. He viewed me not as a daughter, but as a hostile merger waiting to be dismantled. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. The two lawyers stood perfectly still, watching me like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to stop kicking. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. In the trauma bay, when a patient begins to hemorrhage, panic is the enemy. You isolate the bleeder, you apply pressure, you think 3 steps ahead. Liam walked around the kitchen island. He held a ceramic mug in his hand. His posture was relaxed, his footsteps silent on the hardwood. He stopped in front of my father and extended the mug. "Black, no sugar," Liam said softly. "Just how you like it, Richard." My father glanced at the mug, then looked Liam up and down his lip, curling into a sneer of profound disrespect. He did not reach for the coffee. "I do not have time for refreshments," Richard said. "And frankly, Liam, this is a discussion for the adults in the room. This involves real capital, not the kind of pocket change you scrape together teaching high school history." I suggest you stay out of it before Abigail ends up footing the bill for legal counsel you cannot afford." The insult was designed to humiliate, to shrink Liam down, and assert Richard's financial dominance. The lawyers smirked. Liam did not flinch. His expression remained entirely serene. He took a slow sip from the mug he had offered, his eyes locking onto my father. "You know, Richard," Liam began, his voice calm and melodic, carrying the effortless authority of a man used to commanding a classroom. Napoleon Bonaparte had a similar perspective on his opposition. He looked across the field at Waterloo and saw an army he deemed inferior. He thought he was invincible. He thought the battle was already won. Liam lowered the mug, his gaze unyielding. He believed that right up until the Prussians arrived on his flank and crushed his empire into dust. My father rolled his eyes, emitting a harsh, dismissive laugh. "Save the history lesson for your teenagers, Liam. The real world operates on leverage, not textbooks." Richard turned his attention back to me. Clearly bored by the interaction, he tapped the contract one last time. "I want your signature by tomorrow morning, Abigail. Do not test me. You know I will burn that distillery to the ground if I have to." I reached out and placed my hand flat over the thick stack of papers. The paper felt cold against my skin. I did not shove it away, nor did I reach for a pen. "I am going to review the clauses," I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping into a cold, clinical cadence. "I will not sign anything under duress while you stand in my kitchen. You will have my answer soon." Richard smiled. It was a predatory, victorious expression. He mistook my tactical delay for submission. He thought my lack of screaming meant he had broken my resolve. "Smart girl," he murmured. "Have it ready." He turned on his heel and walked out the door, his two corporate shadows trailing closely behind. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Liam and me alone in the quiet apartment. I looked down at the contract, tracing the outline of my grandmother's company name. My father thought he had cornered me. He thought he mapped out every possible move I could make. He threatened my legacy and insulted the man I loved, assuming his financial leverage was an impenetrable shield. He had no idea I was already examining his defenses, searching for the fatal crack. The war had officially moved past the church aisle and into the boardroom. I needed to neutralize his leverage, but first I had to secure the battlefield, and that meant ensuring my wedding venue was untouchable. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop, vibrating with the sharp, jarring rhythm of an incoming message. The screen illuminated, casting a pale glow across the kitchen island where the hostile contract still rested. The sender was Richard. I picked up the device. The text was brief, clinical, and designed to induce maximum panic. "Sign the equity transfer by tomorrow morning. Otherwise, my assistant calls the coastal estate and cancels the credit card on file. Good luck hosting 200 prominent guests on a paramedic budget." I stared at the glowing letters, my jaw locked. He was layering his extortion tactics, moving swiftly from my inherited assets to the immediate logistics of my wedding. He assumed I was currently spiraling, crying on Liam's shoulder, terrified of facing a canceled caterer and a locked venue. Liam watched me from across the kitchen, his dark eyes studying my posture. He did not ask what the message said. He read the shift in my stance, the way my shoulders squared and my grip tightened on the phone casing. "I need to take a drive," I told him, keeping my voice low and level. Liam nodded, taking my empty coffee mug and setting it in the sink. "Do what you need to do, Abigail. I will hold the fort here." I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The Alabama heat hit me the moment I stepped outside, a thick blanket of humidity, carrying the distinct scent of salt water from the nearby Gulf. My truck tires hummed against the blistering asphalt as I navigated the winding coastal highway toward the wedding venue. Richard believed my career was a blue-collar rebellion, a phase I would eventually outgrow when I realized the comfort of his financial umbrella. He never understood the reality of my shifts. He never saw the exhaustion. I spent the last 3 years logging exhausting 80-hour weeks. I picked up every holiday rotation. I volunteered for hazard flights during severe hurricane seasons, strapping into a vibrating aircraft while the sky turned a bruised, turbulent purple. I did not spend my earnings on luxury vacations or designer wardrobes. I hoarded my income. Every paycheck, every overtime bonus, every hazard stipend went directly into a secure private account. My father thought I lived paycheck to paycheck. He severely underestimated the savings potential of a woman determined to buy her own freedom. The venue was a historic property overlooking Mobile Bay, framed by ancient live oaks draped in heavy Spanish moss. The crushed shell driveway crunched beneath my tires as I parked near the grand entrance. Inside the sprawling foyer, the air conditioning offered a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat outside. Evelyn, the lead event coordinator, stood behind a polished mahogany desk. Her usually pristine posture was rigid. She clutched a gold pen so tight her knuckles were white. She looked like a deer caught in high beams. She saw me approach and swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward her office phone. "Abigail, I was just about to call you," Evelyn said, her voice tight with professional anxiety. "Your father's executive assistant left a very alarming voicemail 10 minutes ago." I watched a bead of sweat form at her temple. She was terrified of losing a flagship weekend event. A cancellation of this scale mere days before the ceremony would be a logistical nightmare for her team. "Let me guess," I said, leaning casually against the mahogany desk. "He threatened to pull the financial backing. He told you to freeze the catering orders, halt the floral arrangements, and put a lock on the ballroom doors." Evelyn nodded, her expression grim. "He said the funding was currently under internal review and to expect a formal cancellation notice by tomorrow morning if he did not authorize the final green light." I smiled. It was not a happy expression, but a cold, calculated one. "Evelyn," I instructed softly, "open my client file on your computer. Go directly to the billing tab." She typed nervously, the clacking of the keyboard echoing in the quiet foyer. "Look at the payment history from exactly 60 days ago," I said. Evelyn's eyes scanned the bright monitor. Her shoulders dropped a full inch. Her mouth parted in silent realization as the data on the screen registered in her mind. 2 months prior, I had driven to this exact desk. I sat across from Evelyn's accounting manager and handed over a cashier's check for $45,000. It was a sum built from countless nights treating shattered femurs, stabilizing collapsed lungs, and pulling survivors from twisted highway wreckage. I instructed the department to remove Richard's premium corporate card from the ledger entirely. I transferred the event, the liability, and the ownership of the weekend strictly into my name. Richard never checked his personal statements closely enough to notice a missing pending charge. He operated on the arrogant assumption that his plastic was still the structural foundation of my wedding day. My father was standing in a field, holding a detonator threatening to blow up my world. He had no idea I had already defused the bomb weeks ago. He was gripping a dead wire, waiting for an explosion that would never come. "The balance is 0, Evelyn whispered, letting out a long, shaky exhale. "You are fully paid. He has no financial authority over this contract." "I need physical copies of that 0 balance ledger," I told her. "Print every single invoice, the catering, the string quartet, the lighting rigs, the venue rental fee. I want the receipts showing my name as the sole payer." The heavy commercial printer hummed in the corner of her office. A minute later, Evelyn handed me a thick stack of warm, crisp papers. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a bright red manila folder. The vibrant color was deliberate. It was a visual beacon designed to stand out in a room full of muted tones. I slid the documents inside, feeling the sharp, clean edges of the paper against my fingertips. I snapped the protective elastic band shut and buried the folder deep in my bag. This was my ammunition safely stored until the precise moment of execution. The physical location of my wedding was now fortified. Richard could not lock me out of the estate. He could not starve my guests or silence the music. But as I walked back out to my truck, the blistering coastal air reminded me that the battle was far from over. Securing the real estate was only half the war. My father still controlled the social narrative. Tomorrow night at the rehearsal dinner and the following day, in front of 200 prominent guests, he would play the benevolent patriarch burdened by an ungrateful, unstable daughter. He would poison the well. He would ensure every local politician, hospital board member, and wealthy business associate viewed me with pity. If I walked down that aisle alone, I would visually validate his fiction. I would look abandoned. I needed an escort. I needed someone whose mere presence would shatter Richard's carefully curated social hierarchy and expose his insignificance to the entire room. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I pulled my phone from my pocket, bypassed the recent messages from my toxic family, and scrolled deep into my contacts. I stopped on a name I had avoided calling for 2 long years. My father thought he was the most powerful man in Alabama. He was wrong. It was time to wake a ghost. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, the engine idling while the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the Alabama heat. The red manila folder rested on the passenger seat, a silent testament to my secured venue. I had the physical ground locked down. Now I needed to manipulate the player. Direct confrontation with a man like Richard Smith was a tactical error. If I pushed back right now, he would escalate. He would find another angle, another vulnerability to exploit before the weekend arrived. He thrived on resistance because it gave him an excuse to use his resources. To defeat him, I had to remove the resistance. I had to offer him the exact illusion he craved: total submission. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the headrest. I needed to act. Working in trauma medicine teaches you how to compartmentalize your vocal cords. When a mother screams in the back of an ambulance asking if her child is going to live, you do not let your voice tremble. Even if you know the odds are grim, you project calm. You project authority. Sitting in the humid cab of my truck, I reversed that training. I loosened my posture, let my shoulders slump, and forced a heavy, ragged sigh into my chest. I visualized the exhaustion of a 14-hour shift. I dialed my father's number. The line rang twice before he answered. "Make it quick, Abigail," Richard snapped. His tone was sharp, coated in the irritation of a man interrupted during something vastly more important than his own daughter. "I am reviewing quarterly projections, and I do not have time for another dramatic display of rebellion." I held the phone close to my mouth. I let the silence hang for 3 seconds, allowing the manufactured weight of my defeat to travel through the cellular tower. "You win," I whispered. My voice was frayed, stripped of its usual steel. I injected just enough tremor to mimic a woman who had spent the last 2 hours crying. The shift on the other end of the line was instantaneous. The background noise of rustling papers ceased. I could hear his breath hitch, catching on the sudden intoxicating rush of his own ego inflating. The irritation vanished, replaced by a dark, creeping satisfaction. "Excuse me," he said, drawing out the syllables, wanting to hear me say it again. I rubbed my forehead, playing the role to the hilt. "I am tired, Dad. I am so tired of fighting you. You hold all the cards. I cannot lose the venue, and I cannot deal with the public embarrassment of a canceled wedding. If signing the distillery over to Sloan is what it takes to keep the peace, then fine, you win." A low, rich chuckle rumbled through the speaker. It was the sound of a predator standing over a yielded catch. He did not offer comfort. He did not express relief that his family was intact. He only cared that his authority was restored. "I knew you would see reason, Abigail," Richard purred. His voice took on a magnanimous quality, the benevolent king sparing a peasant. "It is a shame you had to make such a fuss this morning, but growth is often painful. This is the mature decision. Bring the contract to the rehearsal dinner tomorrow night." I continued, keeping the artificial fatigue heavy in my throat. "I will have my lawyer review the fine print just to ensure the liability transfers cleanly. I will sign it in the morning before the ceremony, but you have to promise me you will walk me down the aisle. You have to promise me you will smile." "Of course, sweetheart," he replied. The condescension in that single pet name was thick enough to choke on. "I will have my tailor press the tuxedo tonight. Wear something elegant to the rehearsal. We have a lot to celebrate." I ended the call. I did not pull the phone away from my ear immediately. I sat there in the sweltering truck, feeling the phantom echo of his smug laughter. The hook was set. The bait was swallowed. Richard's greatest weakness was his profound arrogance. He truly believed he possessed the gravitational pull to break my independent spirit in a single morning. By offering him a fabricated surrender, I had effectively neutralized his offensive maneuvers. He would not call the caterers. He would not threaten the venue. He would spend the next 48 hours basking in his perceived victory. His shields lowered, his defenses abandoned. He was expecting a coronation. I shifted the truck into drive and pulled onto the coastal highway. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of moss-draped oaks and shimmering inlet waters. When I walked through my front door, Liam was sitting at the kitchen table grading a stack of history essays. He looked up, his dark eyes scanning my face for a verdict. "He thinks he broke me," I said, simply tossing my keys onto the counter. "He is bringing the papers to the dinner tomorrow." Liam set his red pen down. A slow, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. "The Prussian flank," he murmured softly. I nodded. Before I could elaborate, my phone vibrated against the wood of the kitchen island. A new text message illuminated the screen. The sender was Sloan. I stepped closer and read the words displayed in crisp white bubbles. "Dad just told Mom and me the good news. I'm so glad you finally dropped the stubborn act, Abby. It was getting really exhausting for all of us. So glad we can finally be a happy family again and focus on my new portfolio. See you tomorrow." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the message hung in the quiet apartment. My sister was not an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of our father's tyranny. She was an active participant, a willing parasite ready to consume the legacy our grandmother built, wrapping her greed in the language of familial healing. She used words like happy family as a weapon, a velvet ribbon tied around a dagger. I stared at the glowing screen. I did not type a response. Any reply, even a passive one, would give her something to analyze. Silence was a black hole. It offered them nothing but their own assumptions. Instead of anger, a strange, frigid calm washed over me. I locked the screen and set the device face down. A cold, razor-thin smile stretched across my face. They were all celebrating. My father was likely pouring a glass of his most expensive scotch. My mother was probably booking a spa appointment, thrilled that the messy business of my rebellion was handled. Sloan was busy dreaming about the financial yield of a bourbon empire she did not know how to run. They were entirely complacent. They had lowered every single defensive barrier they possessed. Convinced that the war was over and the spoils were secured, they thought they had backed me into a corner, stripping me of my assets and my pride, leaving me with nothing but a desperate need for their approval. They were tragically unaware of what I was doing in that very corner. I was not cowering. I was not crying. I was reaching for a lifeline they could not possibly anticipate. I picked my phone back up. I bypassed the text thread with my sister. I scrolled past the venue contacts and the caterers. I navigated deep into my contact list, my thumb hovering over a name saved simply as Elias Thorne. The illusion of my defeat was secured. It was time to summon a force my father could not buy, could not intimidate, and could not survive. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen of my phone. The name Elias Thorne stared back at me in stark white letters. It was a name that commanded entire boardrooms, dictated global shipping routes, and sent tremors through the financial districts of the southern United States. More importantly, it was the exact name currently dominating my father's waking hours. Richard had spent the last 8 months aggressively courting Thorne Logistics for a career-defining merger, a deal that would elevate his regional insurance firm into a national powerhouse. My father had only ever dealt with the corporate vice presidents and the faceless board of directors. Elias Thorne himself was a famously reclusive billionaire, a phantom who rarely appeared in public. I pressed the call button. I brought the phone to my ear, listening to the hollow rhythmic tone of the connection attempting to bridge the distance. As the first ring echoed in my ear, the walls of my quiet apartment dissolved. The smell of fresh coffee and Liam's grading pens vanished violently, replaced by the acrid, choking stench of ignited aviation fuel and scorched earth. The flashback hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a moonless night 2 years ago, deep in the jagged spine of the Appalachian Mountains. The wind was howling, whipping sleet across the open door of the medevac chopper. Below us, a shattered Gulfstream jet lay bleeding fire into the dense forest canopy. The fuselage was torn open like a crushed soda can. I clipped my harness to the hoist, the heavy carabiner clicking with metallic finality against my chest rig. The flight mechanic gave me a sharp nod. I stepped out into the dark void, rappelling down 70 feet into the inferno. The heat rushed up to meet me, singeing the edges of my protective gear. My boots hit the muddy incline, and I unclipped, sprinting toward the wreckage. Inside the crushed cabin, alarms blared a chaotic, dying rhythm. The co-pilot was gone. The primary passengers were gone. But pinned beneath a collapsed bulkhead in the rear cabin was a man in a torn, soot-stained suit, Elias Thorne. His face was unrecognizable, masked in ash and lacerations. His chest heaved with terrifying shallow jerks. He was suffocating. The impact had crushed his windpipe. I dropped to my knees in the burning debris, my medic bag hitting the slanted floor. I did not care about his net worth. I did not care about the logistics empire he controlled. In that burning tube, he was just a failing airway. I pulled a scalpel and a rigid plastic tube from my kit. The fire was creeping closer, heating the metal walls around us. "Stay with me, Mr. Thorne." I yelled over the roar of the flames, my hands moving with practiced, relentless precision. "Stay with me!" I made the incision directly into his trachea. The blood was warm and thick. I forced the tube into the airway, bypassing the crushed tissue. He gagged a violent, visceral spasm and then drew in a massive, ragged breath of oxygen. His eyes shot open, wild and panicked, locking onto mine in the darkness. I held his gaze, keeping my hands clamped over the tube, anchoring him to the living world until the rescue basket lowered through the canopy. 3 days later, I stood in the sterile quiet of the intensive care unit at the regional hospital. Elias Thorne was propped up against a bank of pillows, looking battered but fiercely alive. The breathing tube was gone, replaced by a thick bandage. He motioned for me to step closer to the bed. When he spoke, his voice was a ruined, gravelly rasp, permanently altered by the trauma to his throat. "You did not hesitate in the fire, Captain," he whispered, using my flight rank. "Just doing the job, sir," I replied formally. He reached out his hand, bruised and wrapped in IV tape, and grasped my wrist. The grip was weak, but the intention behind it was ironclad. "I do not forget a debt, Abigail," he rasped, his pale eyes piercing through the sterile glare of the hospital room. "You call in this marker whenever you need it, whatever the cost. Whenever the day comes, you call." The memory snapped shut, pulling me back to the humid reality of my Alabama kitchen. The phone clicked on the very first ring. "Thorne," a voice answered. It was the same ruined, gravelly rasp from the ICU, carrying an undeniable heavy authority. He did not use an assistant to screen the number. He had kept my contact saved on a direct line for 24 months. "Mr. Thorne," I said, keeping my voice level, stripped of any emotional tremor. "It is Abigail Smith." The silence on the line lasted less than a second. "Captain," Elias said, the gravel in his tone shifting, adopting a tone of immediate attention. "Are you in trouble?" I did not waste his time with pleasantries or tearful explanations. Billionaires do not respond to melodrama. They respond to situational reports. I delivered the facts in tight military-like terms. I outlined the extortion plot. I detailed the transfer of equity contract involving the Ironwood distillery. I explained the threat of a hostile conglomerate buyout, the weaponization of the wedding venue, and my father's calculated attempt to humiliate me publicly by forcing me to walk down the aisle alone and abandoned. I finished the briefing. A heavy, charged silence stretched across the connection. "I need an escort on Saturday," I stated flatly. "I need someone whose presence neutralizes the threat. I am cashing in the marker." Elias let out a low, dangerous sound, a rumble of pure, focused intent. He was a man who built an empire by identifying weakness and exploiting it. Hearing that the executive currently begging for his corporate capital was simultaneously extorting a trauma medic deeply offended his rigid sense of honor. "Richard Smith is the man pitching the regional merger to my board," Elias noted, his voice dropping into a register that felt like grinding stone. "Yes, sir, he is. He thinks he holds the leverage because he controls the finances." Elias continued analyzing the battlefield aloud. "He expects you to walk into that venue broken. He expects a visual surrender." "That is his exact operational plan," I confirmed. I could hear the faint sound of Elias shifting in a leather chair, the quiet rustle of a man preparing to execute a strategic strike. "Give me the time and coordinates, Captain," Elias Thorne commanded, his voice absolute and unyielding. I relayed the address of the coastal estate, the required arrival time, and the specific entrance protocol. "Do not sign that equity contract," Elias instructed sharply. "Bring the paperwork to the rehearsal dinner as you promised. Play the part of the defeated daughter. Keep his ego inflated. I will handle the rest on Saturday." "Understood. Thank you, Mr. Thorne." I ended the call and set the phone down on the granite counter. Liam was watching me from his seat at the table. He had stopped grading his essays. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "The ghost is awake," Liam observed quietly. I nodded, feeling the adrenaline begin to slowly ebb from my system, replaced by a cold, calculating certainty. The trap was fully armed. Richard had demanded my surrender, and I had given him the illusion of victory. On Saturday, he was going to walk into the church expecting a coronation. Instead, he was going to face the single most powerful man in the Southern Hemisphere. But my father was a notoriously slippery opponent. He had built his insurance firm through decades of aggressive networking and legal loopholes. I knew his extortion tactics regarding the distillery were desperate, but I did not understand why. Why was a man on the verge of a massive corporate merger suddenly resorting to familial blackmail over a boutique bourbon asset? The math did not add up. I needed a clearer picture of Richard's vulnerabilities before the rehearsal dinner the following night. I looked over at Liam. Knowing his background in historical research made him exceptionally skilled at digging through archived data. "I need you to look into his company," I told Liam, "not the public press releases. Dig into the state registry. Look for liens. Look for sudden liquidations. He is pushing too hard for my grandmother's land. Something is wrong with his foundation." Liam pulled his laptop from his satchel, his serene smile fading into a focused, serious expression. "I will see what the public filings say," he agreed, opening the search browser. I walked toward the bedroom to find a dress for the rehearsal dinner. I had to look the part of a yielding, broken bride. I had to sell the lie. But as I pulled a simple, muted dress from the closet, Liam called out from the kitchen. His voice lacked its usual calm melody. It was sharp-edged with sudden alarm. "Abigail." Liam called out, the rapid clicking of his keyboard echoing in the quiet apartment. "You need to come look at this right now. The Prussian flank just became the least of his problems." I dropped the muted dress onto the bed and moved swiftly back into the kitchen. Liam turned the laptop screen toward me, the bright glare illuminating the sharp angles of his face. His dark eyes held a grim, focused intensity. "What am I looking at?" I asked, staring at a complex spreadsheet filled with red text highlighting an unfamiliar corporate acronyms. "You are looking at a house of cards," Liam said softly, his voice carrying the steady cadence he used to explain global conflicts to his students. "I started with the state business registry. Historical research is fundamentally about following the paper trail. It is about understanding who profits and who loses. I applied the same principle to your father's insurance firm. He routes his commercial premiums through 3 subsidiary holding companies before they ever reach the primary corporate account." Liam scrolled down revealing pages of digital records. "I checked the public lien registry in Montgomery. 2 of those subsidiaries have quietly defaulted on their state tax obligations. They are bleeding cash, but that is just the surface layer. Look at this." He clicked open a new tab. It displayed a digital bulletin from a regional financial oversight board. When an insurance firm prepares for a major corporate merger, they are legally required to file preliminary asset disclosures. Richard submitted his preliminary numbers last month to appease the initial inquiries from Thorne Logistics. And I prompted, feeling a cold, hard knot form in this pit of my stomach. "He is missing money, Abigail. A huge amount of it. Millions. Client escrow accounts that should be sitting in secure interest-bearing bonds have been drained. He is operating on a staggering deficit. It is a deficit that would trigger an immediate federal indictment if a forensic accountant took a hard look at his ledgers." I stared at the glowing numbers. The columns of missing funds painted a devastating picture of deception. My father was not a successful titan of industry. He was not a shrewd businessman holding the high ground. He was a fraud, maintaining his lavish lifestyle and bespoke suits with stolen capital. "The Thorne Logistics merger," I whispered, the puzzle pieces snapping together in my mind with lethal clarity. "Elias Thorne is going to send his own audit team to review Richard's books before they sign the final merger paperwork." Liam nodded, tapping his index finger against the edge of the keyboard. "Exactly. When the Thorne auditors open the ledger, they will find the missing millions. The merger will collapse instantly. Furthermore, Thorne's legal team will be legally obligated to report the discrepancy to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Richard will face wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering charges. He is looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary. I leaned my weight against the granite counter. The reality of the situation settled over me like a heavy lead apron used in X-ray bays. The cruelty of the past 3 days took on an entirely different, chilling shape. Richard was not trying to appease Sloane's anxiety. He was not trying to teach me a harsh lesson in familial hierarchy or punish my independence. He was fighting for his actual freedom. "The distillery," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Ironwood is the only unencumbered high-value asset he has left," Liam confirmed, closing the spreadsheet. "But he only owns half of the equity. He cannot liquidate a 50% stake fast enough to generate the required capital. Nor will any major corporate buyer touch a split-ownership property without your explicit legally binding consent. He needs total control of the land and the trademark. If he gets your signature on that contract tomorrow morning, he sells the entire estate to that multinational beverage conglomerate by tomorrow afternoon. He takes the cash plugs, the massive holes in his escrow accounts, and the Thorne auditors find a clean, balanced ledger next week." My sister was nothing but a pawn. Sloane was a convenient, pliable vessel designed to hold the equity during the rapid transfer process. Richard orchestrated the wedding drama to force my hand, utilizing the threat of public humiliation because it was the only weapon he had left in his arsenal. He was a cornered animal, wearing a tailored suit, lashing out to survive. The emotional wound of his rejection sealed itself shut. Any lingering sorrow over my father refusing to walk me down the aisle vanished, replaced by a profound clinical clarity. In trauma medicine, you must accurately diagnose the internal injury to apply the correct treatment. I had misdiagnosed the battlefield. I thought I was navigating a toxic, narcissistic family dynamic. I was actually standing in the crosshairs of a high-stakes corporate survival game. He is terrified, I realized aloud. Feeling the shift in power resonate deep in my bones. "He is drowning," Liam corrected gently. "And he is trying to use your inheritance as a life raft. He targeted your wedding because the timing aligned perfectly with the impending corporate audit. The pressure of 200 guests, the expensive vendors, the public spectacle of a daughter walking alone. He calculated that a bride on the verge of social ruin would sign anything to make the pain stop." I looked at Liam. His steady presence anchored me to the floor. He did not possess vast wealth or imposing corporate titles, but his mind was a steel trap. He had dismantled my father's entire empire with a laptop and an internet connection. Richard had mocked this man just hours ago, calling him financially useless and dismissing his profession. That profound arrogance was going to cost my father his freedom. "Print those lien records," I instructed, my tone hardening into unyielding steel. "Print the tax defaults. Print every single piece of public data linking his subsidiaries to the deficit." Liam reached for the printer cable, connecting it to his device. "Are you bringing this documentation to the rehearsal dinner?" "No," I replied, my eyes narrowing as the strategy formed. "I am bringing the unexecuted contract to the rehearsal dinner. I'm going to walk into that steakhouse, order a drink, and look him in the eye. I am going to let him believe his life raft is secure. The financial records go into the red folder with the venue receipts." I walked back to the bedroom. The muted dress lay on the mattress. It was simple, unassuming, the perfect uniform for a defeated, broken daughter. I stripped off my casual clothes and slipped the fabric over my head. I stared at my reflection in the full-length mirror. My posture was straight, my shoulders set back. I took a deep breath, forcing my muscles to relax, actively practicing the slump of a surrendered spirit. The stakes had shifted dramatically. If I confronted Richard prematurely, he might flee the state. He might attempt to manipulate the records further or find another victim to defraud. He needed to remain tethered to the illusion of his victory until the very last second. He needed to stand in front of his peers, his investors, and Elias Thorne himself, believing he was the smartest, most powerful man in the room. I retrieved the equity transfer document from the kitchen island. I folded it neatly and placed it into my leather tote bag, tucking it safely away. "Are you ready for tonight?" Liam asked, appearing in the bedroom doorway. He wore a crisp blazer and a simple tie looking every bit the grounded, respectable partner my father despised. "I have never been more ready," I said. We walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind us. The drive to the downtown steakhouse took 20 minutes. The evening sky over Alabama was bleeding into a deep, bruised purple, signaling an approaching summer storm. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly, thickening the coastal humidity and adding a physical weight to the air. We pulled into the valet circle of the restaurant. High-end luxury sedans lined the curb, reflecting the neon signs of the downtown district. Inside, the private dining room was reserved exclusively for our party. Richard would be holding court, flanked by his lawyers ready to finalize his extortion. He expected me to slide into my chair, keep my head down, and surrender my grandmother's legacy without a fight. I handed my keys to the waiting valet. I linked my arm securely through Liam's. I let out a long exhale, adopting the carefully constructed mask of submission. But beneath the facade, my pulse beat a steady, lethal rhythm. The history teacher had handed me the keys to the kingdom. My father was a criminal, and I was walking into his celebratory dinner holding the match. The heavy brass-studded doors of the steakhouse swung open, granting us entry into a sanctuary of old money and rare beef. The air was thick with the scent of charred ribeye truffle butter and expensive bourbon. A hostess in a sharp black dress guided Liam and me past the main dining floor, weaving through tables populated by local politicians and old Southern families. We bypassed the mahogany bar and arrived at the private back room closed off by frosted glass partitions. I pushed the sliding door open. My father was already there holding court at the head of a long, polished oak table. Richard Smith was in his element. He wore a midnight blue suit that cost more than my entire medical gear loadout. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch, swirling the amber liquid, while telling a loud, animated story to the two corporate lawyers seated flanking him. The atmosphere did not resemble a rehearsal dinner. It mirrored a hostile corporate boardroom prior to a liquidation vote. My mother, Sylvia, sat slightly down the table, adjusting her pearl necklace and nodding along to Richard's anecdote. Sloane sat directly across from her, scrolling mindlessly on her phone, wearing a vibrant, attention-demanding red cocktail dress that blatantly violated any basic standard of rehearsal dinner etiquette. Several of Liam's relatives, solid working-class people who drove hours from their rural county, were clustered awkwardly at the far end of the table. They looked deeply uncomfortable, nursing their waters and exchanging worried glances. Richard looked up as we entered. His loud laughter ceased abruptly. A smug, victorious grin spread across his face, highlighting the deep laugh lines around his eyes. "Ah, there she is," Richard announced, his voice booming over the ambient noise of the restaurant, ensuring everyone at the table heard him clearly. "The prodigal daughter returns, having finally realized the value of compromise. Come in, Abigail. Take a seat. We have business to discuss before we order the appetizers." He was not going to allow a single moment of grace. He intended to establish dominance immediately. I kept my shoulders slightly slumped, playing the role of the defeated opponent. I navigated the length of the room, pulling out a heavy leather chair near the middle of the table. Liam sat beside me, resting his hand gently on my knee beneath the tablecloth. His touch was a silent anchor, a physical reminder of the digital ammunition we had locked away back at the apartment. "I see you brought the legal team," I noted quietly, my voice purposefully lacking its usual sharp edge. Richard waved a dismissive hand, the ice in his scotch clinking loudly against the crystal. "Just a formality, sweetheart. When large assets are transitioning within a family portfolio, it is always best to have the professionals ensure the liability shifts cleanly. You understand it is for your own protection." Really. The sheer audacity of the lie was suffocating. He was preparing to drain my inheritance to cover his federal embezzlements, yet he packaged the theft as a protective paternal gesture. The lawyers smirked, opening their matching leather briefcases and resting their hands atop the thick, unexecuted equity transfer documents. They were positioned like sentinels ready to force my signature before the salads arrived. I reached into my tote bag and retrieved my copy of the contract, placing it squarely on the table. The thick stack of paper landed with a soft thud. "I brought the paperwork as promised," I said, keeping my gaze lowered, avoiding direct eye contact with Richard. "But I am not signing it in this room. We agreed on tomorrow morning. I need the night to read the final clauses." Richard's smug expression wavered slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. He preferred immediate compliance. However, his arrogance quickly smoothed over the annoyance. He believed I was merely dragging my feet, unable to escape the inevitable. "Fine," Richard conceded, leaning back in his heavy chair and signaling a waiter for a refill. "Tomorrow morning, before the makeup artists arrive, do not make me chase you down Abigail. The estate buyer is standing by, and I will not hesitate to pull the trigger if you stall." The waiter arrived, distributing menus and pouring expensive wine. The tension in the room remained dense, a toxic cloud hovering over the expensive silverware. Liam's father, a retired auto mechanic with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, cleared his throat. He raised his water glass, attempting to inject a sliver of normalcy into the deeply hostile environment. "I would like to propose a quick toast." Liam's father began, his voice gravelly but warm. "To Abigail and Liam, we are so proud of the life you two are building together. May your weekend be filled with—" He did not get to finish the sentence. Sloane pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. She stood up, her vibrant red dress demanding absolute visual dominance. She picked up a butter knife and tapped it sharply against the side of her empty wineglass. The high-pitched clinking cut through the quiet murmurs of the room. "Actually," Sloane interrupted, her voice entirely devoid of an apology, "while we are all gathered here making toasts and talking about building lives, I have a massive announcement of my own." The table went completely silent. Liam's father slowly lowered his water glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. Sylvia clasped her hands together, leaning forward with a look of manufactured delight, clearly aware of what was coming. Richard watched his youngest daughter with an expression of indulgent amusement. Sloane placed a hand dramatically over her flat stomach. "Derek and I have officially decided to start trying for a baby." She paused, waiting for an eruption of applause that did not come. Her boyfriend of exactly 5 months, who sat beside her looking incredibly nervous and slightly hungover, offered a weak, apologetic nod to the table. "We are just so excited for this next chapter," Sloane continued, completely oblivious to the stunned silence of Liam's family. "We wanted to share the news tonight because, well, it is just so important to celebrate the future of the Smith family legacy, especially since I will be managing the Ironwood portfolio soon. It just feels like a new beginning for everyone, so a toast to the future." She raised her empty glass, beaming brightly. It was a surgical strike of narcissism. She deliberately sabotaged the only genuine moment of celebration aimed at Liam and me, utilizing a theoretical pregnancy to siphon the attention back to herself. She even weaponized the impending theft of the distillery, rubbing the stolen asset in my face while demanding a congratulatory drink. My pulse spiked. The instinct to stand up flipped the table and expose the entire fraudulent operation roared in my ears. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the familiar surge of adrenaline preparing my body for a fight. 4 seconds in, hold, 4 seconds out. I utilized the tactical combat breathing technique I relied on when stabilizing critical patients in chaotic environments. I controlled my heart rate. I forced the anger down into a cold, compressed box in the center of my chest. If I reacted now, if I screamed or called out her transparent manipulation, I would validate their narrative. I would be the unstable, jealous sister ruining the dinner. I would give Richard the excuse he needed to escalate. I did not move. I did not glare. I calmly picked up my water glass and took a slow, methodical sip. Liam did not react either. He simply reached across the table, picked up the bread basket, and offered a warm roll to his bewildered father, entirely ignoring Sloane's grandstand. The complete lack of engagement deflated Sloane's performance. She stood awkwardly for a moment longer, waiting for a reaction that never materialized, before sinking back into her chair with a sharp, petulant sigh. The remainder of the dinner passed in agonizing forced civility. The steaks arrived, cooked perfectly, tasting like ash in my mouth. Richard dominated the conversation loudly, discussing his impending merger with Thorne Logistics, boasting about the massive influx of capital he was about to secure. I listened to his lies, analyzing the sheer volume of deception required to maintain his facade. He was sitting at a table with his family eating expensive meat, knowing a federal indictment was breathing down his neck. As the plates were cleared and the checks were quietly settled by Richard's legal team, the room began to empty. Liam escorted his family out to the valet, guiding them away from the toxic atmosphere. I stood up, slinging my leather tote bag over my shoulder. Richard remained seated at the head of the table, finishing the last drop of his scotch. The two lawyers packed their briefcases, securing the documents. My father looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with the predatory satisfaction of a man who believed his trap had snapped shut flawlessly. "I will see you in the bridal suite at 9 tomorrow morning," Richard commanded, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "Have your pen ready. We will sign the paperwork. I will call my estate buyer, and then we can focus on getting you down that aisle. It is going to be a beautiful day, Abigail." I stood at the edge of the polished oak table. I looked at the tailored lines of his suit, the expensive watch gleaming on his wrist, the empty crystal glass resting near his hand. I dropped the slump from my shoulders. I straightened my spine, standing at my full height. I let the mask of submission fall away entirely. I leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the table, closing the distance between us. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded into a dull, distant hum. I looked him dead in the eyes. The expression I delivered held no warmth, no fear, and no defeat. It was the icy, detached stare of a medic declaring a time of death. "Checkmate is tomorrow, Dad." I whispered the words. The volume was low, but the resonance was lethal. I did not wait for his response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the sliding glass doors, leaving him sitting in the sudden, deafening quiet. I walked through the restaurant, my steps sharp and purposeful. I pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the humid Alabama night. Liam was waiting by the truck, the engine running. I climbed into the passenger seat, the adrenaline finally settling into a cold, hard certainty. My father was rattled. The seed of doubt was planted. The rehearsal was over, but the true sabotage was about to begin the moment the sun came up. The dawn broke over Mobile Bay, painting the restless water in shades of bruised peach and pale gold. Inside the bridal suite, at the historic coastal estate, the atmosphere hummed with a frantic, nervous energy. Hair dryers buzzed a steady drone, makeup brushes clicked against porcelain countertops, and the sharp scent of aerosol hairspray mingled with the salty ocean breeze drifting through the open balcony doors. I sat in a plush velvet chair, watching the organized chaos unfold in the wide vanity mirror. My maid of honor, Jess, paced the room with the precise, calculating efficiency of a triage nurse. Jess and I had shared a cramped ambulance cab for 3 grueling years. She knew how to handle arterial bleeds on the side of a highway, and she knew how to manage my anxiety. Today, she was guarding the door. A soft, deliberate knock preceded the brass handle turning. My mother slipped into the suite carrying a silver tray of expensive pastries. She wore a tight, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. Sylvia looked flawless in a muted slate gown, the perfect attire for a woman planning to play the grieving, long-suffering matriarch. She set the tray down on a glass side table, letting out a long theatrical sigh, as if the sheer effort of supporting me had drained her soul. "Good morning, darling," Sylvia sang, approaching my chair. Her manicured fingers grazed my shoulder, feeling cold against my skin. "I wanted to check on you. Today is going to be incredibly difficult given the circumstances. I brought fresh croissants." She was laying the groundwork. She wanted me fragile, hungry for maternal comfort, and acutely aware of my impending isolation. "I am doing just fine, Mom," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on my own reflection in the glass. Sylvia clicked her tongue, emitting a sharp, patronizing sound. "It is okay to be heartbroken, Abigail, walking out there all by yourself without your father to lean on. It is a very stark, lonely image for the guests to process. We just want to make sure you are emotionally prepared for the pity. It will be palpable." She was digging for an exposed nerve, hoping to strike a reservoir of hidden tears. I gave her nothing. My heart rate remained steady, beating a calm rhythm against my ribs. I closed my eyes as the stylist secured the final pins in my hair. Sylvia, realizing her verbal jabs were failing to draw blood, began to wander around the spacious suite. She pretended to admire the floral arrangements drifting aimlessly toward the far corner of the room. Hanging from a brass hook in that shadowed alcove was my heavy canvas garment bag. Inside that protective casing rested the one item Richard could not attach a price tag to. It was my grandmother Clara's antique lace veil. The ivory fabric was a fragile, hand-woven heirloom. Clara wore it decades ago, long before she built the distillery, back when her hands were stained with Alabama dirt. Sylvia, born into the pristine comfort of country club wealth, had always despised Clara's working-class roots. Stealing the veil was not just about sabotaging my wedding day. It was Sylvia's petty attempt to erase the memory of a woman she felt was beneath her social standing. Wearing it was my way of bringing Clara down the aisle with me, a shield against the sterile corporate greed of my parents. Jess was pouring a glass of ice water near the bathroom when she suddenly froze. Her paramedic instincts flared, detecting a subtle wrong shift in the environment. I opened my eyes just in time to see Jess stride across the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "What exactly are you doing, Sylvia?" Jess demanded, her voice cutting through the hum of the hairdryer with military precision. The stylist immediately turned off the machine. The suite fell into a sudden, heavy silence. I stood up and turned around. My mother stood near the garment bag, her spine rigid, her oversized designer tote purse rested open on an upholstered bench. Hanging halfway out of the expensive leather opening was a familiar cascade of delicate ivory lace. Sylvia whipped around her face, flushing a deep, mottled crimson. She stammered, her hands hovering awkwardly over the open bag. I was just organizing the bridal accessories to clear some space." "You are shoving a family heirloom into your handbag," Jess stated flatly, stepping squarely between Sylvia and the exit door. "Hand it over right now." Sylvia puffed up her chest, attempting to deploy the righteous indignation she routinely used to bully retail workers and waitstaff. She looked past Jess, aiming her defense directly at me, banking on my supposed fragility. "Abigail, be reasonable," Sylvia pleaded, her tone shifting into a frantic, high-pitched whine. "I was doing you a favor. Clara's lace is beautiful, yes, but it is far too traditional. It represents a family union. Given that you are making this defiant solo march today, it simply clashes. It does not match the modern, isolated aesthetic you have chosen. I was removing a visual distraction." The psychological manipulation was breathtaking. She was attempting to steal a piece of my heritage to ensure I looked as barren and unsupported as possible. And she packaged the theft as high-end fashion advice. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I walked slowly across the suite, the silk of my bridal robe trailing behind me. I stopped 2 feet away from the woman who raised me. The proximity stripped away her remaining bravado. She shrank back, slightly unnerved by the total absence of grief in my expression. When you treat trauma every single day, you learn the difference between a fatal wound and a superficial scratch. My mother was a superficial scratch. "Take the veil out of your bag," I instructed. The cadence of my voice matched the sterile, unyielding beep of a hospital heart monitor. "Abigail, you are overreacting." Sylvia tried one last time, her hands trembling as she clutched the leather straps of her tote. "Your father is waiting down the hall in the private study to finalize that equity paperwork. If you agitate him now by starting a fight with me, he might leave before the ceremony even begins." I reached out, bypassing her shaking fingers, and pulled the antique lace from the dark interior of her purse. I held the delicate fabric against my chest, smoothing the wrinkled edges where she had carelessly crushed it. I looked down at my mother, seeing the shallow, terrified core beneath her designer clothes. "You lost your daughter today over a piece of lace and a fraudulent contract," I said quietly. Sylvia gasped, taking a physical step backward. She expected rage. She expected a screaming match that she could report back to Richard as proof of my inherent instability. Instead, she received a cold, clinical eviction. The realization that her emotional manipulation had failed entirely struck her like a physical blow. The foundation of her lifelong control was evaporating right in front of her eyes. "Get out of my room," I commanded. "Do not come back until the usher calls your row for seating." Sylvia grabbed her empty designer bag. Her hands were shaking so severely she could barely clasp the golden latch. She practically ran toward the door, her silver heels echoing erratically against the floorboards. She pulled the heavy wooden door open and fled into the hallway, desperate to escape the freezing temperature of my detachment. The door clicked shut, sealing the suite once again. Jess let out a low whistle, shaking her head in disbelief. I have seen intoxicated patients fight off chemical sedatives with less effort than she puts into ruining your day, Jess muttered, walking over to check the lock. She is just the forward scout, I replied, turning back toward the vanity mirror. Richard sent her to soften the target. He wants me distracted, emotional, and off balance before I walk into his study for the contract signing. I sat back down in the velvet chair. The stylist, wide-eyed and totally silent, carefully took the ivory lace from my hands. She draped Clara's veil over my shoulders, securing the antique comb firmly into the crown of my hair. I stared at my reflection. The delicate lace framed my face, providing a stark, beautiful contrast to the hardened steel in my eyes. I did not look like a lonely, abandoned bride begging for scraps of affection. I looked like a soldier strapping on Kevlar. My armor was fully assembled. I stood up and walked toward the balcony doors, stepping out into the thick, humid morning air. Below me, the sprawling grounds of the coastal estate were coming alive. Caterers arranged silver trays on the pristine lawns. The string quartet tuned their instruments under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. And there, standing near the grand entrance of the main foyer, was my father. Richard was already dressed in his immaculate tuxedo. He held a ceramic cup of coffee, gesturing grandly to a group of early-arriving corporate guests. He was holding court, laughing loudly, soaking in the admiration of his wealthy peers. He was actively setting the stage, preparing the audience for my humiliating solitary march down the aisle. He believed his trap was flawless. He had no idea the ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was wired to detonate. The humidity rolling off Mobile Bay began to burn away as the sun climbed higher, baking the lush grounds of the coastal estate. From the second-story balcony of the bridal suite, I watched the luxury vehicles line the crushed shell driveway. Valets in crisp black vests sprinted between gleaming Mercedes sedans and heavy armored SUVs, opening doors for the elite echelon of Alabama society. Local politicians, hospital board directors, and wealthy regional business owners filtered into the grand foyer. My father, Richard Smith, stood at the absolute center of the arriving crowd. He was in his element, operating not as a father preparing to witness his daughter marry, but as a corporate titan hosting a premier networking event. His tuxedo fit flawlessly, the sharp lines accentuating his aggressive posture. I stepped back from the balcony railing, allowing the sheer curtain to obscure my silhouette. I could hear the faint carrying resonance of his booming voice drifting up through the humid air. He was laying the psychological groundwork for my public execution. Richard caught the attention of a group of hospital administrators' men who held significant sway over my own professional career trajectory as a flight paramedic. He offered them warm handshakes, immediately shifting his expression into a mask of solemn paternal burden. "It is going to be a difficult afternoon, gentlemen," Richard announced. He projected his voice just enough to ensure the surrounding clusters of guests caught the theatrical sigh that followed. Abigail is a brilliant medic, truly, but she has always possessed a fiercely stubborn, almost unstable streak when it comes to family tradition. She pushed her mother and me away during the planning process. She is insisting on walking down that aisle entirely alone today. A modern statement, she calls it. I just pray the isolation does not overwhelm her when those doors open. The administrators nodded sympathetically, murmuring quiet condolences regarding the trials of raising an independent, difficult daughter. The trap was masterfully set. Richard was not merely denying me an escort. He was weaponizing my solitude. When I appeared at the back of the church without him, the 200 assembled guests would not see a woman standing strong on her own merit. They would see the damaged, alienated child Richard had just described. They would view me through a lens of profound pity, validating his narrative of superiority. Sloane stood near his elbow, wearing a pale blush gown that intentionally bordered on bridal white. She nodded along to his lies, dabbing at the corner of her eye with a tissue she did not need. My sister was a willing accomplice, soaking up the sympathetic glances from the wealthy crowd, cementing her role as the beautiful stable daughter who would soon inherit the Ironwood legacy. I turned away from the window. My phone vibrated on the vanity. It was a secure message from Liam, currently waiting in the groom's holding room on the opposite side of the estate. "The heavy artillery has arrived," the message read. "He is waiting in the east corridor." A cold electric current of anticipation shot through my veins. Elias Thorne was inside the building. I walked toward the heavy oak door of the suite, my grandmother's lace veil trailing softly against the hardwood floor. Jess stood ready, holding the train of my dress. I was about to descend the rear staircase to finalize the trap. I had to secure the unexecuted distillery contract. Richard was expecting me in the private study adjacent to the main foyer. He believed I was coming to surrender my inheritance. As I navigated the dimly lit back corridors, avoiding the bustling caterers, I could hear the overlapping conversations echoing from the grand entrance hall. I paused near a slatted wooden partition that offered a concealed view of the main foyer. Richard was moving away from the hospital administrators. He gravitated toward the east side of the hall, drawn to a cluster of sharp-suited men holding premium cocktails. These were the senior executives from Thorne Logistics. Richard had invited them specifically to flaunt his supposed wealth and secure their favorable votes for his impending corporate merger. Standing slightly apart from the sycophantic executives leaning casually against a towering marble pillar near the back doors was a man who did not fit the typical profile of a Southern socialite. He wore a bespoke dark charcoal tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light around him. He was older, his hair a shock of thick slate gray. A faint jagged scar peeked out from the collar of his crisp white shirt, tracking a pale line up the right side of his neck. He held a heavy crystal tumbler of neat bourbon, watching the room with pale, predatory eyes. It was Elias Thorne. Since the horrific jet crash in the Appalachians 2 years prior, Elias had retreated entirely from the public eye. He managed his massive global shipping empire from heavily fortified private estates, communicating only through trusted proxies and secure digital channels. Richard Smith had spent 8 exhausting months pitching a regional merger to the Thorne Logistics Board of Directors, desperately trying to secure the capital needed to cover his federal embezzlements. During those grueling negotiations, Richard had never once sat in the same room as the CEO. He had only seen outdated pre-crash photographs. He had absolutely no idea the ghost was standing 10 feet away from him. The dramatic irony was so thick it practically suffocated the air in the hallway. I watched frozen in the shadows as my father adjusted his cuffs and marched directly toward his executioner. Richard approached the quiet, imposing older man, assuming Elias was merely a senior board member or a high-level regional manager. Richard offered a broad, aggressively confident smile, extending his hand. "Welcome to the estate," Richard boomed, forcing Elias to shift his bourbon glass to accept the handshake. "Richard Smith, I believe my team has been speaking extensively with your corporate office in Atlanta regarding our little merger." Elias accepted the handshake. His grip was brief and remarkably cold. He did not introduce himself. He merely offered a slow, deliberate nod, allowing Richard to fill the silence with his own ego. "It is a monumental week for my portfolio." Richard continued, leaning closer, puffing his chest out to convey absolute financial dominance. "We are finalizing the equity transfer of the Ironwood Distillery this morning, a complete acquisition of a legacy brand. It will add a massive unencumbered asset to our balance sheet just before your auditors arrive next week. I assure you your corporate board is going to be incredibly impressed with the capital I bring to the table." Richard was bragging about stealing my grandmother's company to plug the gaping fraudulent holes in his escrow accounts, totally unaware he was confessing this aggressive shell game directly to the man whose signature he required to survive. Elias Thorne took a slow, methodical sip of his bourbon. The pale eyes remained locked on my father's face. The gaze was devoid of admiration. It was the clinical dissecting look of an apex predator evaluating a remarkably stupid prey animal. "Is that right?" Elias rumbled. His voice was a ruined, gravelly rasp, the permanent consequence of the crushed windpipe I had bypassed on the muddy floor of a burning forest. "Absolutely." Richard beamed, utterly deaf to the lethal danger layered within that raspy tone. "Total control of the asset. My daughter Abigail is signing the final release in a few moments. It is a necessary business maneuver. Family sentimentality cannot stand in the way of serious corporate expansion. I am sure a man of your experience understands the ruthless necessities of high-level commerce." Elias swirled the amber liquid in his glass. The ice clinked softly. He looked at the tailored suit Richard wore, noting the expensive watch and the polished arrogance. "I understand ruthlessness intimately, Mr. Smith," Elias replied quietly. The gravel in his voice scraped against the marble pillars. I also understand the catastrophic consequences of severely underestimating your opponent." Richard chuckled, clapping Elias heartily on the shoulder, entirely missing the direct fatal warning embedded in the statement. "Well said, my friend." Richard laughed. "Enjoy the top-shelf liquor. I have a stubborn bride to wrangle in the study." My father turned away, marching confidently toward the private office where he expected me to surrender my future. He left Elias standing by the pillar. The billionaire did not smile. He simply watched Richard walk away, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, concentrated disgust. I stepped back from the wooden partition, my heart pounding a fierce, victorious rhythm against my ribs. The trap was perfectly primed. The bait was in place. Richard believed he was walking into a room to claim his life raft. He did not realize the ocean had just evaporated. I smoothed the front of my dress, adjusted the weight of my grandmother's lace, and walked down the hallway to face my father for the final charade. I left my father sitting in the private study clutching a sealed ivory envelope containing the unexecuted equity contract. I had fed him a calculated lie, claiming my hands were trembling too much to sign the final line without ruining the parchment. I promised to execute the document immediately following the ceremony. Blinded by his own towering ego, he accepted the delay. He poured himself a celebratory drink and strode into the sanctuary to claim his front row seat, ready to watch his broken daughter march to the altar alone. I stood in the dim, quiet vestibule of the coastal estate. The heavy oak double doors separating me from the gathered elite of Alabama society loomed ahead. The thick wood muffled the murmurs of 200 guests and the bright, swelling notes of the string quartet tuning their instruments. Jess knelt beside me carefully, adjusting the long train of my silk gown and smoothing the edges of my grandmother Clara's antique lace veil. She gave my ankle a reassuring squeeze before stepping back into the shadows. The air in the vestibule shifted, growing distinctively colder. Footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor, sharp and deliberate. Elias Thorne stepped out from the corridor. He wore a bespoke charcoal tuxedo cut with terrifying precision. The fabric seemed to absorb the ambient light, framing his broad shoulders and unyielding posture. The pale, jagged scar tracing the side of his neck stood out against his crisp white collar, a silent testament to the burning fuselage we had both survived. He did not look like a traditional wedding escort. He looked like an apex predator stepping onto a battlefield. He stopped beside me. His pale eyes scanned my face, searching for any trace of hesitation or fear. He found only clinical resolve. "Are we ready to execute this operation, Captain?" Elias asked. His ruined, gravelly voice echoed softly in the cavernous space. "We are ready, Mr. Thorne," I replied. Elias extended his right arm. I reached out and looped my hand through the crook of his elbow. The fabric of his suit felt like forged iron beneath my fingertips. His physical presence was an immovable anchor. On the other side of the heavy oak barrier, the string quartet transitioned into the processional march. The deep, resonant hum of the cello vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up through the soles of my shoes. Inside the sanctuary, the guests rose to their feet. The rustle of expensive fabrics and the soft clearing of throats signaled their collective anticipation. I knew exactly what my father was doing in that moment. Richard Smith was standing in the front row, adjusting his silk tie, actively preparing an expression of profound pity. He had primed the entire room to witness a tragic spectacle. He expected the heavy doors to swing wide, revealing a solitary, abandoned woman attempting to salvage her pride. The venue coordinator gripped the brass handles of the double doors. She looked at me, gave a sharp nod, and pulled the heavy wood inward. Blinding afternoon sunlight poured into the vestibule, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The sanctuary stretched out before us, a sprawling expanse of polished pews, white orchids, and towering stained glass windows. Elias and I stepped forward into the light. The visual impact hit the room like a seismic wave. The collective intake of breath from 200 guests sucked the oxygen directly out of the sanctuary. The hushed, sympathetic whispers Richard had so carefully cultivated died instantly in their throats. We did not rush. We matched our steps to the slow, steady tempo of the cello. I kept my chin level, staring straight ahead toward the altar. Liam stood at the end of the aisle. He wore a simple, elegant dark suit. A profound, serene smile touched the corners of his mouth. The history teacher recognized the exact moment the tide of the war turned. The Prussian flank had arrived. As Elias and I navigated the long aisle, the social physics of the room began to fracture. The wealthy executives, the hospital board members, and the local politicians stared in stunned silence. They recognized the man walking beside me. Elias Thorne was a phantom in their world, a billionaire who dictated their economic realities from behind fortified walls. Seeing him here operating as my personal escort shattered every lie Richard had planted during the cocktail hour. I was not an alienated, stubborn child. I was a woman flanked by unparalleled power. We approached the front rows. My father stood at the edge of the center pew. His posture was initially relaxed, his hands clasped casually in front of him, a performative mask of paternal sorrow plastered across his face. Then his eyes focused on the man holding my arm. The transition was catastrophic. The smug confidence drained from Richard's features, leaving behind a pale, sickly gray hue that clashed violently with his expensive spray tan. His jaw unhinged, his hands dropped to his sides, the fingers twitching in sudden, uncontrollable spasms. Elias did not break his stride. He turned his head a fraction of an inch, locking his pale, predatory gaze directly onto my father. The stare contained decades of ruthless corporate dominance. It was a look forged in hostile takeovers and destroyed empires. Elias did not need to speak a single word. His eyes delivered a lethal, unequivocal message. "You are dead." Richard visibly flinched, his shoulders collapsing inward as if he had been physically struck. The illusion of his authority disintegrated, leaving a desperate, terrified fraud standing in a tailored suit. Sloane stood directly beside our father. She wore her blush gown clutching a lace handkerchief she intended to use for dramatic effect. She possessed none of the corporate acumen required to recognize the billionaire standing 2 feet away from her. She only saw an unfamiliar older man ruining the narrative she had helped construct. "Who is that old man?" Sloane whispered loudly, her shrill voice cutting through the delicate music. "Why is he walking Abigail?" The ignorance of the question hovered in the tense air. Standing in the pew directly behind my toxic family were the senior executives from Thorne Logistics. These were the men Richard had spent the morning trying to impress, the men whose favorable audit reports he desperately required to avoid a federal prison sentence. One of the senior executives leaned forward. He bypassed Sloane entirely and aimed his response directly at the back of my father's neck. "That old man," the executive hissed, his tone dripping with sheer disbelief and creeping horror, "is the chief executive officer your father is currently begging for capital." The word struck the front row like a localized earthquake. Sloane's mouth snapped shut. She shrank back into the wooden pew, her eyes wide with sudden comprehension. Sylvia let out a faint, strangled gasp, raising a trembling hand to her pearl necklace. But it was Richard who absorbed the lethal blow. The executive's whisper confirmed his worst nightmare. The man he had patronized in the foyer, the man he had boasted to about stealing my grandmother's distillery, was the exact entity holding the keys to his impending federal indictment. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized my father. Sweat beaded along his hairline, ruining his immaculate styling. His breath became shallow and rapid. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, silently begging for an explanation, a reprieve, or a sudden reversal of reality. I did not offer him a single shred of comfort. I did not break my stride. I looked past his terrified face, maintaining my focus on the man waiting for me at the end of the aisle. Elias and I stepped past the front row, leaving Richard suffocating in the wreckage of his own arrogant extortion. The trap had closed. The bait was swallowed. My father was now trapped in a room surrounded by the very people who would dismantle his life by Monday morning. We reached the steps of the altar. The music faded into a graceful, lingering silence. The real execution was scheduled for the reception, but the psychological dismantling was already complete. We halted at the base of the marble steps leading to the raised dais. The trailing edge of my grandmother Clara's antique lace settled against the polished stone floor with a soft, whisper-thin hiss. The sanctuary was so quiet, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch somewhere in the first few rows. Sunlight poured through the towering stained-glass windows, casting fractured geometric patterns of ruby and cobalt across the white floral arrangements lining the aisle. Traditional wedding protocols dictate that the escort places the bride's hand into the groom's, a symbolic transfer of ownership from one patriarch to the next. Elias Thorne did no such thing. He released my arm, stepping back half a pace to stand shoulder to shoulder with me as an equal. He turned his attention to the man waiting at the altar. Liam did not shrink under the intense scrutiny of a global logistics titan. He met Elias's pale, calculating gaze with the same serene gravity he utilized to command a classroom of restless students. He stood tall in his dark suit, exuding a quiet, unshakable dignity that no amount of stolen corporate capital could ever replicate. Elias extended his right hand. Liam met it without hesitation. The grip was firm and deliberate, a silent exchange of profound respect between two men who understood the true currency of character. Elias leaned forward, narrowing the physical distance. His voice was a low, ruined rasp intended only for the three of us standing in that sacred space. "She thrives in the fire, son." Elias murmured, the jagged scar on his neck tightening as he spoke. "Make sure you build her a safe place to land." Liam nodded, his dark eyes shining with unwavering conviction, his thumb brushing the knuckle of Elias's bruised, scarred hand. "Every single day, sir," Liam replied softly. "That is a promise." Elias released the handshake. He pivoted on his heel, turning his broad back to the altar to face the 200 assembled guests. The congregation held its collective breath. The tension in the room was a tangible, heavy force. Seated directly behind my toxic family, the executives from his own corporation sat rigid, their tailored shoulders stiff, unsure of protocol in the sudden, unexpected presence of their reclusive chief executive. My mother, Sylvia, clutched her pearl necklace, her knuckles white, her curated expression of maternal sorrow replaced by genuine, unadulterated confusion. Sloane sat frozen. Her lips parted the dramatic lace handkerchief lying forgotten in her lap. Elias did not request a microphone. He did not require artificial amplification to command a room. His voice, permanently altered by the crushed trachea I had bypassed on the muddy floor of a burning Appalachian forest, carried a natural, resonant authority that filled the vaulted ceiling of the coastal church. "It is the greatest honor of my life," Elias stated, measuring every syllable with deliberate, heavy intent, "to walk the woman who saved it." The declaration struck the pews like a physical shockwave. The hushed whispers and manufactured pity my father had so carefully cultivated during the morning cocktail hour evaporated instantly. The narrative was obliterated. I was not an alienated, stubborn daughter staging a pathetic rebellion against a loving patriarch. I was a decorated flight paramedic who had plunged into a raging inferno to pull a titan of industry from a shattered fuselage. The social hierarchy of the room inverted in a fraction of a second. The elite attendees, the local politicians, and the hospital board members who had spent the morning offering Richard sympathetic nods now stared at me with unvarnished awe. The whispers that rippled through the back rows were no longer laced with condescension. They were electric with sudden reverence. Elias stepped down from the dais. He bypassed the second row entirely, striding toward a prominent reserved seat on the bride's side, effectively establishing himself as my chosen family. The officiant, an older retired judge with a kind, weathered face, cleared his throat and opened his leather-bound book. The ceremony commenced. I turned my full attention to Liam. The hostile extortion tactics, the fraudulent equity contracts, the stolen heirloom lace, all of it faded into the distant periphery. I stood bathed in the warm prismatic light filtering through the stained glass, feeling the steady calming warmth of Liam's hands enveloping mine. For the past 3 days, I had operated in a state of hypervigilance, treating my wedding weekend like a tactical deployment. Now, standing at the altar, I allowed the armor to fall away. I recited my vows with a clear, unwavering cadence. I did not stumble over the words. I was entirely present in my triumph, focusing solely on the man who had helped me dismantle an empire from our small kitchen table. Liam's voice was a melodic anchor promising partnership loyalty and an unbreakable shared front. We exchanged the simple, elegant gold bands, the cool metal sliding over my finger, securing a future built on truth rather than leverage. From the extreme edge of my peripheral vision, I could observe the devastating physical toll the ceremony was inflicting upon my father. Richard sat in the front pew, trapped in a prison of his own meticulous design. Perspiration gathered thick on his forehead, rolling down his temples to soak the pristine white collar of his bespoke tuxedo shirt. He wiped his face repeatedly with a trembling hand. The arrogant, boasting patriarch who had commanded the foyer just 30 minutes prior was entirely gone. In his place sat a desperate cornered fraud, watching his survival strategy burn to ash. He knew the Thorn Logistics executives seated directly behind him were observing his rapid physical deterioration. He could feel their questioning stares burning into the back of his neck. He knew his leverage over the Ironwood distillery had evaporated the moment Elias claimed the aisle. Without my signature on that unexecuted contract waiting in the private study, Richard could not liquidate the Bourbon estate. Without that sudden influx of fast cash, he could not plug the gaping fraudulent holes in his escrow accounts. He was doing the terrifying math in his head. The impending corporate audit was no longer a hurdle. It was a death sentence. The realization that his federal indictment was now unavoidable was suffocating him in real time. The officiant pronounced us husband and wife. Liam leaned in. His kiss was a warm, grounding seal on the victory we had secured. The string quartet erupted into a bright, triumphant symphony, the vibrant notes chasing away the last remnants of the morning's shadows. We turned to face the congregation. As we walked back down the long aisle together, projecting a unified, unshakable front, the guests rose to their feet, offering a thunderous ovation. I caught a fleeting glimpse of Richard's face as we passed the front row. He was not looking at me. He was staring blindly ahead, his eyes wide with the frantic, calculating terror of a trapped animal. But a desperate man facing a total loss of freedom rarely surrenders quietly. Richard could not flee the estate. His towering ego and his sheer panic would demand one final catastrophic attempt at damage control. The ceremony was a flawless, beautiful victory. But as we stepped out of the sanctuary and headed toward the reception hall, I knew the war was not over. The reception was about to become the site of a high-stakes corporate execution, and my father was going to walk directly into the firing line. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary closed behind us, sealing the triumphant symphony inside. The transition from the hushed reverence of the ceremony to the kinetic, buzzing energy of the cocktail hour was immediate. Guests filtered out onto the manicured lawns overlooking Mobile Bay, eager to discuss the monumental shift in power they had just witnessed. Waitstaff in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, balancing silver trays laden with champagne flutes and miniature crab cakes. The air was thick with humidity, and the chaotic hum of 200 people completely recalculating their social algorithms. Liam and I stood near the edge of the crushed shell driveway, accepting warm congratulations from genuine friends and colleagues from the trauma center. We maintained a deliberate distance from the epicenter of the patio, observing the battlefield from the perimeter. I scanned the sprawling crowd, searching for the tailored midnight blue suit of my father. I found him hovering near the expansive outdoor bourbon bar, desperately trying to construct a firebreak against the impending inferno. Richard was operating on sheer narcissistic adrenaline and profound denial. His survival strategy hinged entirely on reclaiming the narrative before the Thorn Logistics executives could process the implications of Elias Thorn's surprise appearance. Richard assumed that if he projected enough unshakable confidence, he could gaslight the entire assembly into believing the jaw-dropping aisle walk was a meticulously coordinated, joyful surprise arranged by the father of the bride. I watched him signal the bartender, ordering a double pour of premium scotch. His hands still carried a faint, erratic tremor, but he forced a broad, hearty smile onto his face. He scanned the perimeter of the bar, locking onto his target. Elias Thorn stood a few yards away, leaning casually against a stone pillar draped in blooming jasmine. He was not mingling. He stood entirely alone, a silent, imposing sentinel holding a fresh glass of neat bourbon. The senior executives from his own corporation were clustered nearby, nursing their drinks and casting nervous, deferential glances toward their reclusive leader, unsure if they should approach. This was the opening Richard needed. If he could publicly engage Elias in a warm, familiar exchange, he could signal to his investors that he possessed elite inner-circle access. He could salvage the optics of the merger. Richard adjusted his silk tie, took a deep breath to steady his racing pulse, and marched directly toward the billionaire. "Elias," Richard boomed. He projected his voice loudly over the clinking glasses and ambient jazz music, ensuring the cluster of Thorne executives heard the familiar address. He closed the distance rapidly, extending his hand and forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and hollow. "So glad you could make it for my little girl," Richard declared, attempting to clap Elias on the shoulder. "What a spectacular surprise. I told Abigail we needed to orchestrate something truly memorable for the grand entrance. I must say, keeping your arrival off the official guest manifest was a stroke of logistical genius. It certainly gave everyone a thrill." Richard kept his hand extended, waiting for the billionaire to reciprocate the warm, conspiratorial greeting. He was banking on the unwritten rules of high society etiquette, assuming Elias would play along to maintain public decorum. Elias did not shake his hand. He did not smile. He did not blink. The silence that fell over that specific corner of the patio was absolute. The ambient noise of the reception seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of ice shifting in crystal glasses. The Thorne executives standing nearby ceased their conversations instantly, their attention snapping toward the confrontation unfolding beside the jasmine-draped pillar. Elias slowly, deliberately lowered his arm, setting his heavy crystal glass down onto the polished teak wood of a nearby cocktail table. The bottom of the glass connected with the wood with a sharp, definitive thud. He turned his body slightly, squaring his broad shoulders to face my father fully. He looked at Richard's extended, empty hand, then brought his pale, predatory gaze up to meet Richard's increasingly desperate eyes. When Elias spoke, he did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to command absolute obedience. He utilized the low, ruined rasp that scraped against the humid air like jagged steel. "Your daughter is a hero," Elias stated flatly, stripping away the artificial warmth of the gathering. Richard's forced smile faltered the corners of his mouth, twitching as the gravity of the situation began to crush his chest. "Elias, please let us not discuss business right now. It is a day of celebration." "You are a parasite," Elias interrupted, his voice cutting through Richard's pathetic defense with surgical precision. The word hung in the humid air, lethal and unretractable. The group of Thorne executives exchanged horrified, wide-eyed glances. No one moved. No one spoke. "You are a parasite who attempted to extort your own flesh and blood 48 hours ago," Elias continued, his tone devoid of any corporate diplomacy. "You utilized the sanctity of this event and the threat of public humiliation to blackmail a decorated trauma medic into surrendering her grandmother's legacy. You thought you could operate in the shadows. You thought you held the high ground because you control a few regional escrow accounts." Richard froze. His breathing ceased entirely. The blood drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving him looking like a polished corpse standing in a tailored suit. He recognized the specific phrasing. Elias did not just know about the Isle Walk drama. He knew about the Ironwood distillery. He knew the intimate, ugly details of the hostile equity transfer contract currently sitting unsigned in the private study. "I do not do business with men who bleed their own families to cover their professional incompetence," Elias murmured, leaning forward a fraction of an inch, invading Richard's personal space. The pebble dropped. The facade shattered, exposing the rotting foundation beneath. Richard tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He looked wildly around the immediate area, his panicked gaze landing on the cluster of Thorne executives. These were the men who held the power to approve the merger, the men who could save him from the impending federal audit. The executives were actively stepping backward, physically distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout. They looked at Richard not with respect, but with profound career-ending disgust. They had just heard their notoriously ruthless CEO declare this regional insurance broker a parasite. The merger was not just dead, it was a toxic liability. Elias picked up his crystal glass from the teak table. He took a final slow sip of the premium bourbon. He did not offer Richard another glance. He turned his back on my father, dismissing him entirely from his reality, and walked away toward the far edge of the manicured lawn. Richard remained rooted to the crushed shell driveway, clutching his untouched scotch. His chest heaved as the oxygen rushed back into his lungs in ragged, desperate gasps. He was completely isolated, marooned in the center of his own lavish party. The men he needed to impress had witnessed his total emasculation by the single most powerful figure in their industry. His professional reputation was disintegrating just as rapidly as his family dynamic. I watched the entire execution from my vantage point near the garden wall. Liam stood beside me, his hand resting securely on the small of my back. "He is cornered," Liam observed quietly, his dark eyes analyzing my father's erratic, panicked movements. "A man losing his entire empire in an afternoon is dangerous. He will not just accept the defeat and walk to his car." Liam was entirely correct. The clinical diagnosis of a narcissist dictates that when their primary source of power is annihilated, they immediately seek a secondary target to project their rage and reclaim a sliver of dominance. Richard was out of corporate ammunition. The financial leverage over the distillery was gone. The Thorne Logistics merger was dead. He could not salvage his career, so he would instinctively attempt to salvage his damaged ego by shifting the blame. And he possessed a highly trained, deeply conditioned proxy, ready to execute a hostile diversion. Across the patio, I saw Richard grab Sloane by the elbow, his grip tight enough to wrinkle the fabric of her blush gown. He leaned down his face inches from her ear, whispering furiously with frantic, aggressive gestures. Sloane's eyes darted toward the large white reception tent, her expression morphing from confusion into a venomous, defensive anger. My father had loaded his weapon. He was handing the detonator to my sister. The sophisticated corporate warfare had failed, so they were pivoting to crude emotional sabotage. The toasts were about to begin inside the reception tent, and Sloane was preparing to hijack the microphone. The sun dipped below the horizon, pulling the stifling coastal heat out to sea and leaving behind a thick, humid twilight. Guests began their migration from the crushed shell patio into the sprawling white reception tent. Towering crystal chandeliers hung from the peaked canvas ceiling, casting a warm golden illumination over the circular dining tables. Waitstaff moved with practiced elegance, pouring expensive champagne and arranging the first course. Yet the underlying hum of conversation carried an electric, fractured tension. Nobody discussed the exquisite floral centerpieces or the curated menu. Every hushed whisper centered on the phantom billionaire who had just publicly humiliated Richard Smith near the jasmine-draped pillars. Liam and I took our places at the sweetheart table, elevated slightly above the polished wood of the central dance floor. From this vantage point, the entire battlefield lay exposed. Richard and Sylvia sat at the premier family table positioned near the front, but the space around them felt quarantined. The Thorne Logistics executives had deliberately requested a table relocation, moving their party to the extreme opposite side of the tent, putting as much physical distance as possible between themselves and my father's radioactive presence. The evening schedule dictated the traditional sequence of toasts. Jess, standing near our table, smoothed the front of her gown and retrieved a folded piece of paper from her clutch. The DJ lowered the ambient jazz music to a faint rhythmic pulse, preparing to hand over the wireless microphone to the maid of honor. Before Jess could navigate the space between the tables, a blur of blush fabric intercepted the audio technician. Sloane snatched the silver microphone from the stand with a frantic, uncoordinated swipe. Her movements were erratic, driven by the desperate instructions her father had hissed into her ear moments prior during their furious exchange on the lawn. Sloane marched to the exact center of the dance floor. She did not tap a glass to request attention. She lifted the electronic device to her mouth and let out a loud theatrical sob that echoed sharply through the high-end perimeter speakers. The room went entirely still. Waitstaff froze in place, holding silver trays suspended in midair. "I am sorry to interrupt the schedule," Sloane cried, her voice trembling with a heavy manufactured grief. "But someone has to speak the truth tonight. This was supposed to be a day of profound family unity, a day to celebrate the legacy our parents built for us." She paused, lifting a lace handkerchief to dab at the corner of an eye that produced 0 actual tears. She pointed a trembling finger in my direction, utilizing the spotlight to cast me as the villain of her fictional narrative. "But Abigail always does this," Sloane accused, her pitch rising into a shrill, grating register. "She always finds a way to hurt this family." I sat back in my chair, resting my hands on my lap. I felt no surge of anger, only the cold, clinical observation of a predictable pathology running its course. When a narcissist loses their primary source of power, they deploy their most pliable proxy to create a chaotic diversion. Sloane was executing the final crude maneuver my father had left in his depleted arsenal. "Our father gave her everything," Sloane continued, her voice echoing off the canvas walls. "He built an empire to protect us. He wanted to walk his oldest daughter down the aisle. And instead of honoring his love, she brought strangers here today to ruin his reputation. She paraded an outsider into our sacred space just to break our father's heart and humiliate him in front of his peers." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their mahogany chairs. The high society attendees recognized a desperate, tasteless spectacle when they saw one. This was not a passionate defense of a loving patriarch. It was a crude public meltdown orchestrated by a family rapidly losing their grip on reality. The elite crowd possessed a remarkably low tolerance for such naked displays of desperation. I felt a subtle shift in the air beside me. Liam did not clench his fists. He did not issue a sharp defensive command across the room. He stood up with the serene, unhurried grace of a veteran educator who had spent a decade neutralizing chaotic disruptions in crowded, restless environments. He bypassed the center of the room entirely, charting a direct, quiet path toward the DJ booth nestled in the shadowed corner of the tent. Sloane was ramping up for the grand finale of her speech, drawing a deep, shuddering breath to deliver another practiced sob regarding her own fragile emotional state. Liam reached the audio deck. The DJ, a young man looking utterly terrified by the unfolding family drama, took a wide step backwards, surrendering his station. Liam leaned over the blinking lights of the soundboard. He located the primary receiver box connected to the wireless frequency. He reached out with steady hands and pulled the thick black audio cable free from the main console. A sharp static pop cracked through the speakers, followed by instantaneous heavy silence. Sloane's mouth remained open, her vocal cords vibrating, but the amplified volume vanished. Stripped of the electronic enhancement, her shrill accusation sounded tiny, distant, and remarkably pathetic. She tapped the silver mesh of the microphone, producing a panicked, hollow rhythm, unable to comprehend the sudden loss of her platform. Liam walked out of the shadows, his footsteps measured and even against the polished floorboards. He stopped 2 feet in front of my sister. Sloane glared at him, her chest heaving, attempting to muster the arrogant superiority her father usually provided. It failed to materialize. He reached out and gently removed the dead microphone from her rigid grip. He did not yank the device. He took it with the firm, undeniable authority of an adult confiscating a dangerous toy from a reckless child. He leveled his dark, intelligent eyes upon her. "Sit down, Sloane," Liam instructed softly. His tone carried no malice, yet it possessed enough natural resonance to reach the surrounding front-row tables. "You are embarrassing yourself," he added, delivering the unvarnished truth with surgical precision. The blunt reality of his statement hung in the humid air. A low, unified murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled guests. The elite crowd cast judging, dismissive glares at the blushing figure standing isolated in the center of the room. Stripped of the microphone and abandoned by her captive audience, Sloane's bravado crumbled into dust. Her face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. She turned on her heel and fled back to the isolated family table, sinking into her chair and burying her face in her hands. Liam walked back to the sweetheart table, setting the disabled microphone down onto the linen tablecloth. He took his seat beside me, offering a faint, reassuring smile. The diversion was neutralized without a single drop of spilled blood. I looked past Liam, locking my gaze onto the premier family table. Richard watched his proxy fail in real time. His face contorted into a mask of pure, trapped panic. The secondary target had been disarmed. He had no more leverage, no more proxies, and no more lies left to spin. He gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning a stark bone white. He started to push his chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. He was preparing to either launch his own desperate tirade or flee the premises entirely before the Thorne executives could initiate the impending legal fallout. I knew the window for containment was closing rapidly. The emotional sabotage had been silenced, but the corporate fraud remained unexposed to the broader room. It was time to execute the final clinical strike and bury his false narrative permanently. I reached beneath the draping fabric of our elevated table and closed my fingers around the crisp edges of the red manila folder. I stood up from the sweetheart table. The silk of my gown whispered against the polished wood of the elevated platform. I did not require a microphone, nor did I need a dramatic, tearful introduction. My voice carried the trained cutting projection I utilized when issuing verbal trauma protocols across chaotic emergency bays. I stepped down onto the main dance floor, the red manila folder grasped firmly in my left hand. I halted in the precise center of the room, occupying the exact physical space Sloan had vacated minutes prior in disgrace. The 200 guests turned their attention toward me. The ambient rustling of silk and the clinking of crystal ceased. For the past 72 hours, my father has waged an aggressive, calculated campaign to control the narrative of this weekend. I stated my tone sharp and level, echoing clearly off the high canvas ceiling. Richard froze halfway out of his chair, his eyes widened, the raw panic radiating from him in palpable waves. He recognized the tone. It was the same detached clinical cadence I used right before checking for a pulse on a trauma victim. He sank back into his seat, immobilized by the sudden spotlight. He approached many of you during the cocktail hour. I continued pacing slowly, letting my gaze sweep across the tables populated by regional elites and corporate investors. He sold you a story of a benevolent patriarch burdened by a stubborn, unstable daughter. He utilized the optics of my solo walk down the aisle to garner your pity, cementing his position as the long-suffering victim of my supposed ingratitude. I stopped pacing. I squared my shoulders directly toward the premier family table. But my father's entire narrative relies on a single fundamental lie. I declared, raising the red folder so the bright color caught the ambient light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. He told you he possessed the financial authority over this evening. He used that perceived leverage to attempt a hostile corporate extortion. He demanded I sign over my inherited 50% equity in my late grandmother's ironwood distillery, threatening to pull the funding for this venue if I refused to submit. A collective gasp echoed through the tent. The elite attendees possessed a high tolerance for petty family drama, but blatant corporate extortion involving legacy assets crossed a sacred boundary within their affluent circles. Whispers erupted sharp, and judging aimed like daggers at Richard's isolated table. I unclasped the elastic band securing the folder. The sharp snap echoed loudly. I extracted the thick stack of printed zero-balance ledgers generated by Evelyn's office. My father believed he held the detonator to my wedding, I said, holding the crisp papers high above my head, presenting the physical evidence to the stunned crowd. He assumed his premium credit card was the foundational structure of my world. I lowered the documents, turning to face Richard directly. I paid for this venue 2 months ago, Richard. Every single flower, every plate of food, every string the quartet played. The payment did not come from a trust fund or a corporate subsidiary. It was secured by 6 consecutive years of medical hazard pay night shifts and overtime trauma rotations. You were threatening to detonate a bomb that lacked explosives. I took 2 slow steps toward his table. I did not hurl the papers at him. I did not scream. I placed the stack of undeniable empirical receipts cleanly onto the white linen tablecloth, positioning them right beside his untouched plate. "You do not own me," I whispered, keeping the volume low enough to force him to lean in, amplifying the intimacy of his defeat. "You never did." Richard stared at the zero-balance ledgers, resting mere inches from his trembling fingers. The physical manifestation of his complete irrelevance paralyzed him. His mouth worked silently, unable to process the data. The illusion of his absolute control, the very core of his narcissistic identity, shattered into dust. The room remained submerged in a heavy, electrified silence. The guests were processing the sheer audacity of his attempted extortion, recalculating every interaction they ever had with the regional insurance broker. Then a chair scraped back from the far edge of the tent. Elias Thorne stood up from the isolated table, housing his logistics executives. The billionaire did not rush. He navigated the narrow spaces between the circular tables with the slow, measured gait of an executioner approaching the block. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide, unobstructed path for the reclusive titan. Elias stopped a few feet from Richard's table. He did not look at Sylvia, who was shrinking visibly into her chair, nor did he acknowledge Sloane, who stared at her plate in terrified silence. The pale, predatory eyes remained locked exclusively on my father. Richard looked up. A strangled, pathetic noise escaped his throat. He saw the grim finality etched into Elias's scarred features. Furthermore, Elias rumbled, his ruined, gravelly voice slicing through the thick humidity. My audit team initiated a preliminary forensic review of your corporate ledgers yesterday afternoon. And Richard, we bypassed your curated summary reports and accessed the primary escrow accounts. The blood that had briefly returned to Richard's face during his panic drained away once again, leaving him a ghastly, translucent shade of gray. The word escrow fell upon him like a physical blow. We located the massive deficit, Elias stated, stripping away the final layer of deception. We tracked the millions of dollars you illegally siphoned from client holdings to maintain your subsidiary shell companies, the capital you intended to replace by stealing Abigail's inherited distillery. The Thorne executive seated nearby nodded in grim confirmation. The remaining guests recoiled physically, inching away from Richard's table as if his mere proximity carried a contagious disease. Embezzlement was the ultimate unforgivable sin in their high society ecosystem. It was an immediate social death sentence. There is no merger occurring between our firms, Elias declared, delivering the ultimate lethal payoff. I do not acquire bankrupt fraudulent liabilities. My legal department transmitted the findings of our preliminary audit to the Securities and Exchange Commission 2 hours ago. There is only an impending federal investigation waiting for you on Monday morning. Elias did not wait for a response. He did not require a confession or an apology. He delivered the corporate kill shot with surgical precision, pivoted on his heel, and walked calmly back toward his seat. Richard remained anchored to his chair, staring into the abyss of his own creation. His narrative of superiority was utterly annihilated by the undeniable empirical data presented on the table and the crushing federal reality waiting for him outside the estate walls. He was no longer a powerful patriarch or a shrewd businessman. He was a cornered, exposed criminal with nowhere left to hide. The final blow had been delivered, but the physical environment of the reception remained. The tension needed to fracture completely to allow the genuine celebration to begin. Richard could not stay in that room under the crushing weight of 200 judging stares without his fragile psyche snapping entirely. The inevitable exodus was about to commence, a silent, damning retreat that would cement his permanent isolation. The silence left in the wake of the revelation hung heavy beneath the peaked canvas of the reception tent. 200 pairs of eyes remained fixed upon the premier family table. In the high society ecosystem of the Southern elite, reputations are forged over decades, but can be dismantled in a matter of seconds. The assembled guests had just witnessed a comprehensive dismantling. A hospital board director, the same man who had nodded with profound sympathy during my father's fabricated sob story in the foyer, was the first to move. He stood up from his chair, calmly buttoned his suit jacket, and deliberately turned his back on Richard Smith. He did not offer a parting glance. He simply charted a path across the polished dance floor, walking directly toward Liam and me. One by one, the rest of the room followed his lead. It was a synchronized, unspoken excommunication. The local politicians, the wealthy regional investors, and the esteemed physicians all rose from their seats and physically pivoted away from the center table. They formed a steady, respectful procession leading to the sweetheart table. The hospital director extended his hand to me, his expression radiating genuine admiration. He congratulated us on a beautiful ceremony and praised my steady composure under pressure. The line of guests behind him echoed those sentiments, offering warm wishes and shaking Liam's hand. I looked over the shoulders of the approaching well-wishers, observing the isolated island my toxic family now occupied. Richard remained anchored to his mahogany chair, staring blankly at the stack of zero-balance venue receipts resting beside his untouched dinner plate. The tailored midnight blue suit he wore suddenly appeared 2 sizes too large, hanging off his slumping frame like a discarded costume. He realized the fatal truth. No one was going to speak to him. No investor was going to answer his calls on Monday morning. His credit lines were likely already triggering fraud alerts, and the federal authorities were preparing to review his entire existence. He looked at my mother. Sylvia was ghostly pale, her manicured hands trembling so severely she could not maintain her grip on her pearl necklace. She recognized that her country club status, her charity board seats, and her curated social standing were entirely erased. She was now the wife of an exposed embezzler. She snatched her designer clutch from the table, her breath hitching in genuine terrified sobs. Sloane sat beside them. Her blush gown wrinkled her previous arrogant grandstanding, replaced by a profound hollow shock. The reality of a frozen trust fund and a non-existent distillery portfolio finally registered in her mind. Richard slowly pushed himself up from the table. He did not possess the courage to walk through the main center aisle of the tent. He could not endure the hundreds of judging stares and the backs turned in synchronized disgust. He signaled to his wife and his youngest daughter with a weak, defeated gesture. The three of them turned away from the grand entrance. They navigated the narrow-shadowed perimeter of the tent. Keeping their heads bowed, they hurried past the stacked catering crates and the clearing stations, opting to flee through the swinging metal doors of the service exit. They disappeared into the humid coastal night, scurrying out through the loading dock to avoid facing the reality of their own ruin. The moment the service doors swung shut behind them, the stifling toxic atmospheric pressure vanished from the reception. It felt as though a heavy, suffocating tarp had been lifted off the entire estate. Jess walked over to the DJ booth, offering the terrified audio technician a bright, reassuring smile. She gave him a sharp nod. The DJ slid the volume fader up, filling the tent with a vibrant, upbeat soul track. The transition was immediate and beautiful. Waitstaff resumed their graceful circulation, pouring fresh champagne and distributing the first course. Laughter, genuine and unburdened, echoed off the canvas walls. Liam and I stepped onto the dance floor for our first dance, surrounded only by people who truly respected the partnership we had built. The armor I had worn for the past 72 hours finally fell away, leaving behind a profound, radiant peace. I caught a fleeting glimpse of Elias Thorne standing near the exit of the tent. He raised his crystal glass in a silent parting salute, then turned and vanished into the darkness, a ghost returning to the shadows, having settled his debt. The reception transformed into a joyous, authentic celebration, continuing deep into the Alabama night. The story flashes forward 1 month. The crisp, clean air of late October swept through the rolling hills of northern Alabama. The oppressive summer humidity had broken, leaving behind bright blue skies and the scent of drying leaves and rich earth. I stood on the sprawling wraparound porch of the Ironwood Distillery. The property stretched out before me, a beautiful expanse of ancient oak trees and weathered brick outbuildings housing rows of aging bourbon barrels. The deed to the entire estate rested securely in a safety deposit box listed solely under my name. The legacy my grandmother Clara built was fortified, safe from hostile corporate takeovers and greedy liquidations. The justice system had moved with terrifying, predictable efficiency. The Securities and Exchange Commission, acting on the detailed forensic audit provided by Thorne Logistics, descended upon Richard's insurance firm within 48 hours of the wedding. Federal marshals seized his corporate servers and locked the doors of his downtown office. His assets were frozen. His subsidiary holding companies were dismantled. Richard was currently bankrupt, stripped of his bespoke suits and his luxury vehicles, sitting in a holding facility awaiting trial for multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. His high-priced corporate lawyers had abandoned him the moment the retainer checks bounced. Sylvia and Sloane had quietly relocated to a small rented apartment 2 states away, entirely fracturing the fragile, toxic alliance they had relied upon for so long. The front screen door of the distillery tasting room creaked open, breaking the morning silence. Liam stepped out onto the wooden porch. He wore a heavy flannel jacket carrying 2 steaming ceramic mugs. The rich aroma of dark roast coffee mingled perfectly with the faint sweet scent of sour mash drifting from the production floor. He walked over and handed me a mug, his fingers brushing warm against mine. He stood beside me, leaning against the sturdy wooden railing, looking out over the quiet, thriving estate. "It is peaceful out here today," Liam noted softly, taking a slow sip from his cup. "It is," I agreed. I shifted my grip on the warm ceramic, glancing down at my wrist. The rugged olive-drab paramedic watch was still strapped there, a constant reminder of the grueling shifts and the steady pulse required to survive the darkest moments. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp autumn air fill my lungs. The weight of the past decade, the constant striving for an approval that was never meant for me, was gone entirely. I looked at the man standing beside me, the quiet history teacher who had helped me map out the battle plans on our small kitchen island. I thought about the billionaire who had crossed a state to honor a life debt. I thought about Jess standing guard at a hotel room door to protect a piece of fragile antique lace. Family is not defined by shared bloodlines or a matching surname. Family is the specific collection of people who choose to stand shoulder to shoulder with you when the fire burns the hottest. My father tried to break me by letting me walk alone. He assumed the isolation would force my surrender. He assumed I required his shadow to feel secure. Instead, he handed me the greatest gift a parent could ever inadvertently provide. He taught me exactly how to stand on my own 2 feet. When we look back at the wreckage of Richard Smith's carefully curated empire, it is easy to focus on the spectacular corporate fallout, the dramatic aisle walk, and the breathtaking collapse of a wealthy man's towering ego. We are drawn to the spectacle of the federal investigations, the canceled wedding funds, and the satisfying justice of a billionaire stepping out of the shadows. But beneath the surface of the shattered trust funds and the revoked country club memberships lies a much quieter, far more devastating tragedy. It is at its absolute core a tragedy of parenting. The story of Abigail, Sloan, Richard, and Sylvia is not just a tale of corporate extortion. It is a profound mirror held up to the modern American family. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. What does it truly mean to raise a child? And what is the actual cost of mistaking financial provision for paternal love in American culture? Particularly within the traditional family structure, there is a pervasive and dangerous myth that success as a parent is measured by the roof you provide and the portfolio you build. Richard Smith fell victim to this illusion, allowing his ambition to completely overwrite his humanity. He believed that because he could write a check for a luxury coastal wedding, he inherently owned the bride. He conflated financial leverage with familial loyalty, failing to understand that a checkbook can never replace the quiet, steady work of emotional guidance. Raising a child requires an architecture built on absolute honesty, unwavering fairness, and deep emotional awareness. These are the invisible bricks and mortar of a healthy home. Richard and Sylvia abandoned these principles entirely, choosing instead to manage their family like a cutthroat corporate board. They instituted a toxic hierarchy, elevating Sloan as the golden child while casting Abigail as the independent scapegoat. They weaponized their affection, distributing it only when it served their immediate narrative or masked their own profound insecurities. When parents abandon fairness, they do not just harm the child they push away, they utterly paralyze the child they claim to protect. Sloan was coddled, shielded from consequence, and taught that manipulation was a valid substitute for hard work. She was given the illusion of importance, but denied the opportunity to develop any genuine character. As a result, when the artificial foundation of her life evaporated, she was left stranded, possessing no internal compass to navigate the real world. Abigail, on the other hand, was pushed out into the cold. She was forced to learn resilience in the back of a trauma helicopter because she could not find it at her own kitchen table. This dynamic is a terrifying reflection of what happens when parents prioritize their own comfort and social optics over the long-term emotional development of their children. True family responsibility is not about molding a child into a convenient accessory that enhances your public image. It is about equipping them with the integrity to stand firm when the world attempts to break them. It is about teaching them that their worth is inherent, not tied to a signature on an equity contract or their willingness to submit to a toxic demand. If we wish to guide our children effectively, we must possess the courage to be emotionally transparent. We must admit our own flaws rather than gaslighting our families to cover our tracks. Richard's ultimate downfall was not caused by a missing escrow account. It was triggered by his absolute refusal to be an honest man. He built a labyrinth of lies, and when he finally became lost within it, he tried to use his daughter's inheritance as a map to find his way out. He forgot that a father's primary job is to protect his child from the fire, not to throw them into the flames to save himself. Stories like Abigail's resonate so deeply because they touch upon a universal vulnerability. We all yearn for a safe harbor. We all want to believe that the people who brought us into this world will be the ones standing beside us when the shadows grow long. When that fundamental trust is broken, it forces us to redefine the very concept of home. It requires us to build our own sanctuaries surrounded by the families we choose rather than the ones we were assigned. If this narrative resonated with you, if you have ever had to untangle yourself from the heavy expectations of a manipulative environment, or if you have had to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet when the people who were supposed to hold your hand walked away, you are not navigating that path alone. I encourage you to subscribe and follow the channel Luke Vengeance. We share these stories not just for the thrill of the payoff, but to build a community of survivors to remind each other that toxic loyalty always has an expiration date and to celebrate the incredible strength it takes to reclaim your own narrative. As we reflect on the quiet porch of the Ironwood Distillery, breathing in the crisp autumn air alongside Abigail and Liam, we are left to ponder the legacy we are currently building within our own walls. Every interaction with our children, every conflict resolved, and every truth spoken or suppressed is a seed planted in the soil of their future. Are we raising children who will know how to navigate the storms with unshakable integrity? Or are we raising children who will fracture the moment their leverage disappears? Are we building a home that operates as a sanctuary of unconditional support? Or are we constructing a gilded cage of conditional approval? The answers to these questions rarely arrive with the dramatic fanfare of a billionaire stepping out of the shadows. They arrive quietly decades later in the brief moments of silence before a major life decision is made. Look closely at the faces sitting around your own dinner table tonight. The empire you are truly building is staring right back at you, learning exactly what it means to love, to lead, and to survive. And one day, whether you are prepared for it or not, the harvest of the seeds you are planting today will finally come due.